Hello, everyone. Welcome into the Guilty as Charged podcast here. I was about to say bold breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. I'm Alex, of course, here to talk about everything related to the NFL draft this week, as an NFL draft has already passed after 2 months of all the mock drafts and the debating after free agency. Thanks to anyone who obviously watched our live streams over the last couple days. Thanks to anyone who kept up with the podcast while Steven and Tyler and sometimes me were doing mock drafts and draft simulations and all this stuff and diving into top 10 prospects and doing all these things. It's different than like our normal Chargers coverage during the season. So, it's a very specific type of audience thing as opposed to the, everyone who watched us cry after the Jacksonville game. So we know it's a certain type of fan that's tuned into the draft. So thanks for everyone watching that. Steven and Tyler will have you guys covered with the grading of every prospect and discussion on every prospect in order on the Chargers channel tomorrow. But I thought today I would sort of open the floor for questions and sort of a conversation back and forth here on Twitter and ask for your guys' questions. I asked immediately after the draft ended on Saturday and sort of let those questions come in and build up over time just to see what people were thinking, the morning after the day of and all that stuff. So without any further ado, let's get to some of these questions. First one is from Ross Johnson, who asks, who is your NFL pro comparison for each player drafted by the Chargers? This is a little bit of a tough question to answer just because there's some players in this class that I don't think have like a one-for-one fit in the NFL. Quentin Johnston, for example, is one of those players where I think if you were to just talk about like his body type and the way that he can move, I would probably talk about him as like an Alshon Jeffrey type of player. But he's not like a boundary catcher and is a track athlete, right? In terms of his like speed after he catches the ball, right? So that almost reminds you more of like a Martavis Bryant, for example, like when he was kind of in his prime with the Steelers before, unfortunately, off the field stuff sort of derailed his career. But he was like a total freak to stop, in the open field when he got the ball and was able to just like put tons of space in between him and the defense. So for me with Quentin Johnston, I lean a little bit more towards the Martavis Bryant comp, not in terms of like what he will be as a receiver, but just the outlook and some of the things that you can do with him. That is one of the more like, kind of think of him as like a souped up Martavis Bryant almost, in that sense. For the second round, we got Tuli Tuipulotu if we want to compare him to somebody. The easiest one is Cam Jordan, although I don't think he has quite as much bend as Cam Jordan does. But, he is sort of your prototypical, like, edge player that can also play the inside, or, go inside on a specific play and rush the passer that way. And also holds up pretty decently well against the run, too. I could go total Chargers pandering and say dollar store Khalil Mack, but that's not who Tuli Tuipulotu reminds me of when I watch him. I don't think he's like a one-for-one fit in terms of trying to replace Bosa or Mack next year. Third round, we have Dion Henley. Henley is interesting because I think he's almost like one-for-one your Drew Tranquil replacement in terms of what he can do as a, lining up on the edge, which he's done previously. He's kind of your undersized, position switch backer, right? Obviously was a former wide receiver who converted to linebacker. And if you actually look at the RAS scores and see how Kaiser White graded out and tested out versus how Dion Henley did, they're actually pretty similar, right? In terms of like smaller guy, Kaiser playing safety, converted to linebacker, Dion playing wide receiver, then converting to linebacker. Very similar in that sense. And so I would actually say in that way, they're like pretty, similar as players in that sense. So for me, I would actually go with kind of Kaiser White as like the body type comp, but sort of more like the mentality of Drew Tranquil, especially in pass coverage. And then in the run game, where Henley, I think at first in the NFL will probably get a little bit overwhelmed. I think that will slowly improve over time, much like it did for Tranquil. Derius Davis, is kind of a tough one to like come up with a comp for simply because there's not a ton of like 5'8", 160 like guys out there. I think if you were to like to try to come up with a comp for him, it would probably just be, I don't know if there's like a guy that just like totally sticks out to me. Some people have said like he's the kind of wide receiver kick returner version of Sproles, which I don't hate as a comp in terms of how he moves, but like also don't want to compare him to like a legend. But I think that he's a player that can have a longer career and kind of use his athleticism in that way, where he ends up playing faster than like again what his like size would indicate to you. So I'll go with that one. Although again, like there's just the problem with making a comp for him is there's just not a lot of players his size walking around. But I think he's a terrific returner. Not saying you're getting Devin Hester at the position or anything like that, but almost kind of like a mini Travis Benjamin with better hands is kind of how I would describe like Derius Davis's like speed and his ability as a returner, but also better football IQ than end stage Travis Benjamin in terms of returning. So that's one thing for sure. We go to the 5th round, and that obviously gives us to Jordan McFadden. I think Steven's kind of been right on the money. McFadden is kind of your like prototypical dollar store Zion, right? He obviously is not that high of a prospect because of his consistency from rep to rep and doing all these things, but put him in a cage with Duke Manyweather, and I'm sure he'll be Zion Johnson in no time. Say that facetiously, but of course, I do think he is like a bigger bodied prospect that is probably like your prototypical swing tackle guard, depending on where they want to move him. If he does have to play in the future, I wouldn't expect him to probably have to play this year, but we also said the same thing with Jamari last year, and look how that turned out now. He's going to be starting on the Chargers 2023 offensive line, obviously. 6, we have Scott Matlock. Scott Matlock reminds me a lot of Joe Gaziano. I think some people compare him to Morgan Fox, which I think Morgan Fox is a little bit lighter, and Morgan Fox kind of has like more like technique he can beat you with in terms of like getting by offensive linemen and getting by blockers. I don't think Matlock is quite that guy. I think he's more of like will kind of overpower you and be like a fraction of a second faster than you think a guy of that size would that be. And that's sort of what I thought of when I watched Joe Gaziano in previous preseasons, as well as when he played in some games this year, and of course recorded his first NFL sack, which was a fun story. Now he's in Atlanta with Gaziano, I think so. Yeah. 7th round, Max Duggan. I'm gonna mince my words here a little bit. Max Duggan is Sam Ehlinger. I don't think he's any different. I think that's going to be a harsh comp for people to hear, but Max Duggan does not have an NFL quality arm in that sense. And I think when you look at his game, it's very much based on what he can do with his legs. And if the Chargers, let's talk about preseason, right? If the Chargers design some stuff for him in the preseason where like he can use his legs and like kind of, just get quick hitters to receivers, get a lot of screens in there, then like that's kind of the optimal way to use Max Duggan. But to be clear, like when it comes to his arm, he just does not have an NFL arm. And that's why I think his ceiling is ultimately like a QB2 backup for 5 or 10 years kind of guy. And like he's very much athletically Ehlinger, but neither of them have that like arm where you can just rely on them from drive to drive to drive. They might string one good one together, but then like some of the underthrows and some of the mechanical issues really come into focus. So that's just sort of what I think of Duggan. I know some people are higher on him on Chargers Twitter. I'm personally not. When it comes to Seapolt, he asks, what are your guys' negatives about Quentin Johnston? Steve Smith, I think people have seen this clip on Steve Smith's podcast, but basically Steve Smith like kind of talked about him as a body catcher and the inconsistency from play to play, lacks nuance in his routes, isn't aggressive in getting the ball. He didn't totally hate him, but Quentin Johnston was the least favorite out of the top wide receivers for Steve Smith. I'm not surprised that Zay Flowers was probably Steve Smith's favorite because, he's very reminiscent in terms of the body type and in terms of the player you're getting. I also am not surprised that, Quentin Johnston was the least favorite of Steve Smith too. So, in terms of the criticism, like all of that does exist for Quentin Johnston on tape. Although, like this kind of goes back to my point that I made when the pick was made, when we were on stream, which is just that I think a lot of these issues are more like mechanical than something that's in Quentin Johnston's DNA, right? That's the debate. Is like, is Quentin Johnston going to change at the NFL level, or is he just is what he is, right? And to me, the ability to just like high point the ball, right, as opposed to body catching, like that's simply like a technique thing, right? And I think that you talk about a quarterback like Justin Herbert who's going to put it right on the money and put the ball exactly where it needs to be at any given point in time. I think that's a skill that he's going to be developed. And you talk about a guy that's a nuanced route runner to learn from. Yeah, Keenan Allen's there, man. Not to mention, I don't think Quentin Johnston's a bad route runner, right? Like, I, again, don't think he is like Jordan Addison adjacent or, Zay Flowers level of like route running and nuance to all of these routes. But I also don't think he's anything to like scoff at either as a route runner, right? Knows how to like kind of, certainly in comparison to like a Mike Williams when he came into the league, Quentin Johnston is coming in there with more of a bag and more of a route tree than Williams out of Clemson, right? Like, and I just feel like that's how people have been talking about him, as though like he doesn't have a bag. And I don't think that's necessarily true when you watch the tape. As far as the drops and stuff like that, absolutely. Like, those are problems that exist, right? He has like a great game against West Virginia, does all the things you ask, but he also has two crucial drops in that game. One which I would probably assign to Max Duggan on tape, and then one which I would kind of assign to him and Quentin Johnston. But, regardless of who your quarterback is, you kind of have to make the catches when you have to make the catches, right? But for me, like, getting him to high point the ball, it's not like he has small hands either, right? This isn't a Kenny Pickett scenario. It's just about getting him to use his bodies and his facilities, that he has better, right? And to me, if you get him to just correct those two small things, it's, again, I'm not discounting it and saying it's not a big if. I do think that he has the highest wide receiver potential in this class. And I get that that's uncertain. I get that that's a thing to, kind of wait for in his development, as opposed to like, he's ready to like, just be like a game wrecker right now, like Jamar Chase is. But we've also been spoiled by the last couple of receiver classes where you have guys like Smith and Waddle and Chase, all come in and sort of take over the league. Jefferson, of course, as well. And this class doesn't have, in my opinion, any of those guys. But the guy that can become that guy, should he fix the things he needs to work on during the catch, is Quentin Johnston. And like, I sort of made this point facetiously on tape, but like, if you look at him before the catch and you look at him after the catch, he's Jamar Chase, right? Like, you can see it on tape too. I say that a little bit like facetiously, but at the same time, like, that is why the potential is sky high, is because of what he can do after the catch and what he does before the catch in terms of getting open, right? I agree he needs to be more aggressive and high point the ball instead of body catching and all these things. But to me, I do think you have to look at the potential here. And I think that when you talk about the potential, I think Steve Smith sees more potential in somebody like Zay Flowers than I do. And I might see more potential in someone like Quentin Johnston when you look at, again, that RAS profile. Does have to improve the consistency, of course. But to me, in the modern NFL, I'm taking Quentin Johnston over any of the receivers in the first round other than Jackson Smith and Jigba any day. And he's specifically a Chargers fit to the point where you can have Mike Williams and ask him to, do the jump ball things and ask him to catch on the outside. And you're not asking Quentin Johnston to do as much of that, certainly in year one. So I also think he's in the perfect area to kind of develop his game too. Comes from Quentin Johnston Enjoyer. A lot of people changed their name to that this week. To Wayne Cavion on Twitter. Does not taking a running back show the team's trust in Spiller, or is there a free agent out there that we are targeting? I don't know if there's like a free agent out there that we're targeting. Tom Telesco actually did say in his press conference like a week ago before the draft that the team expects more out of Jaw Taylor, JT Woods, and Isaiah Spiller specifically. He mentioned those three names in terms of production in 2023. Does that mean that the team actually has more faith in Spiller? Hard to say until we see the results, right? and hard to say until we see them give Spiller the requisite snaps that show that they have the faith in him, because we did not see that in year one. Luckily, Joshua Kelly played really well last year, and they got running back production when they needed to get it out of some other guys. But, you would like to see more from Spiller in that way. But I'm not going to say that not using a pick means that they love Isaiah Spiller, because if you actually look at their undrafted free agent class, which I'm doing in another tab right now, they also brought in Tyler Husman, and they brought in Elijah Dotson, right? So clearly they wanted to bring in some bodies for some form of competition in training camp. Not that those guys are going to make the team, because they already have 3 or 4 running backs, depending on what they think of Roundtree on a given day, who's still with the team. But for me, I don't think this was as much about we have faith in Spiller as we just want to prioritize some of the other parts of our offense right now. The other thing that I will say, well, no, I'll save that for another question that we'll get to later. But yeah, in general, I don't think that this means that they have more faith in Spiller. I'll leave the free agent part for another question we're going to get to. At Blackout, D Pity asks, what's our long-term answer with Eckler? And did this draft definitively solve our receiver woes? What's our long-term answer with Eckler? I mean, I think that they're not going to re-sign him after this year. I think that they're going to, basically make him play out the last year of his deal here in 2023, and then kind of move on from him. I don't think they're in a position to, come back to the negotiating table in any significant way, unless Austin Eckler wants to take, some of the deals that were initially offered. But if he still believes that that's below market value for him, I don't believe that the Chargers are going to come back to that table and negotiate in a meaningful way at this point. So that's sort of the situation with Eckler, and has been the situation for the last 2 months, I guess, of this, period, talking about the Chargers, right? As far as did this draft solve our receiver woes, I mean, the thing about that is, a lot of the Chargers receiver woes were simply last year that the receivers weren't healthy. Now, absolutely, they did have one of the slower receiver rooms, especially after Guyton went down. But, if Keenan had stayed healthy, if Mike had stayed healthy for, longer periods of time, then we're not talking about, the fact that they're slow so much, right? And a lot of that was also a Joe Lombardi issue. But they do get Quentin Johnston, and they do get Derius Davis here, who are 2 very naturally athletic people who will certainly boost the speed of the wide receiver room. Quentin Johnston running a 4.46 to a 4.49 at his pro day. And then Derius Davis, I believe, running a 4.36 or something like that. So both of them, I think both of them are former track stars too, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, they definitely increase the speed in the receiver room, and I believe ultimately kind of increase the potential of where this group can go. Let's go to the next question. Brandon Chrisman at Dayman117. Which player that the Chargers drafted has a hidden development trait that can possibly come out and make them a Rookie of the Year candidate? I think it's only Quentin Johnston. Really, when we talk about Rookie of the Year, it's either quarterback, wide receiver, running back for Offensive Rookie of the Year. Slater probably should have won Rookie of the Year that he was drafted, but he's an offensive tackle, right? So I think Quentin Johnston is the only Rookie of the Year candidate they have. If you really want to make an argument for Thule, you could, I guess, as Defensive Rookie of the Year. But the problem with that is, I just think he's not going to get the stats and the numbers that he would need to get to be Defensive Rookie of the Year. It's probably going to go to an edge player or a cornerback like it did to Sauce Gardner last year. So for me, there's probably no Defensive Rookie of the Year candidate. But Quentin Johnston certainly is one. I wonder, how much attention and media push he'll get based on the season he's having relative to a Bryce Young, relative to a CJ Stroud, though, relative to a lot of the quarterbacks that were drafted. So that will obviously be something to kind of watch out for. But Quentin Johnston, if he plays just a little bit cleaner than he did at TCU, and he's working with Justin fucking Herbert, I don't even think that's a hidden development trait. Yes, of course, that could produce a Rookie of the Year candidate. Woj at Huston Gerbert asks, who did you feel was our best value pick, and also who was our biggest reach? Best value pick. I think you could go to Jordan McFadden if you wanted to. He was a guy that some people projected to go in the 4th round. They got him in the 5th. I'll say Quentin Johnston was like their best value pick in terms of not reaching on that 1st round pick and getting a true premium player at the position that they did. And in my opinion, was, the best wide receiver on the board. You could talk about, again, drafting like Nolan Smith there or drafting like another player that maybe would have been better. But again, I think for future investment, that pick was pretty crucial for the Chargers too. Quentin Johnston was, in my opinion, their best pick. Biggest reach. This is an interesting question. Derius Davis is someone who's very polarizing in that sense too, because a lot of people called him a reach on Twitter when I don't know if that's really what the case was with him, because in my opinion, you look at him and it's like, okay, he went in the 4th round, which if you did PFF mock draft simulator and you did all these things, that was higher than when he was expected to go. But also day 3 is much less about the draft board and where these guys are rather than kind of negotiating what you want to do in rounds 4 and 5 that's best in value. And then in round 6 and 7, as we saw with someone say Xander Horvath last year, it's a lot about negotiating who's going to be an undrafted free agent, who's going to hit the market, who don't we want to hit the market. And, for example, we saw the Chargers do that with Max Duggan, right? Max Duggan met with the Cowboys and the Jets, and clearly there was going to be another team that offered Max Duggan, undrafted free agency. And so the Chargers said, nope, we want him, right? So instead of letting him hit undrafted free agency, they signed him. And that's very similar to what happened with Xander Horvath last year in terms of the Chargers kind of negotiating what would happen with his agent as well. So, for me, it's hard for me to call any day 3 pick as we see it now a reach. If you just go strictly off the consensus board, Derius Davis is the biggest reach, but I wanted them to double dip at receiver. And it's also important to note that all of these consensus boards that you see with Derius Davis specifically are grading him as a receiver, right? They're not grading him as a kick returner, punt returner too. And if you add the specialist element in there of Derius Davis, I mean, look, some teams are taking kickers and punters on day 2 of the draft and day 3 of the draft as well. So the fact that you're getting a wide receiver and you're getting a return specialist, I think that that's something that the big boards don't necessarily account for when they're just drafting, hey, here's my wide receiver 1, 2, 3, 4. So I don't think Derius Davis was even a bad value pick, in my opinion. I hate saying it. I don't think it was a reach. But if you're just asking who was the best pick and who was the worst pick, I'm going to say the best pick was Quentin Johnston and the worst pick was Max Duggan. That's just what I think at this point of the draft. Andrew Donnelly asks, who was your favorite day 3 pick and why? I've gone into it, but I do think my favorite day 3 pick is Derius Davis. The Chargers have needed juice in the returner room. Andre Roberts was fine for what he did here, and in terms of being a punt returner last year, DeAndre Carter was awesome. But it's been so long since the Chargers have had a reliable punt returner and kick returner for the team. You can just go back to when they were trying different things, and Desmond King did well for a little bit, then he fell off. Travis Benjamin, of course, had his era as the return guy and had his high moments too, where he scored touchdowns and also, towards the end was running backwards into the Patriots end zone, right? So to be able to fix that, I think is such a priority for the Chargers and puts them in such a better position on offense too, because the more drives that you're starting ahead of the 25 is just such an advantage. And the Chargers were one of the, I wouldn't say one of the worst teams in that metric prior to Ficken, but yeah, they were for a while in terms of starting field position. And so if you get a guy who's consistently has the speed and the returner IQ that Derius Davis does, I think that's worth a 4th round pick. And you add on what he can do as a route runner and what he can do as potentially a receiver down the road on top of that, and as an overall offensive weapon, was my favorite day 3 pick by far. Also adding in the fact that, again, it's a double dip on receiver, which is something that I felt that they needed to do this draft, and something that a lot of Chargers fans felt they needed to do in general. Andrew at Bolt Up Andrew, which position group of the undrafted free agents has the best chance of having a player make the active roster based on the Chargers' current depth and skill at that position? This is going to be interesting. So I'll actually pull up the screen. I do have the list of undrafted free agents on me right now. I haven't, again, like, I'm not going to lie to you. I have not watched like a ton of these players to the point where I can go, this guy is going to make the roster, this guy isn't. But the one thing that you see when looking at the Chargers undrafted free agent list is, despite not taking a cornerback in the class, right, they have a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 defensive backs in their class when you add up the cornerbacks and the safeties. And I think that that's, pretty notable to point out because, of course, the J.C. Jackson injury, right? I think that in that sense, if you don't know if J.C. Jackson is going to be able to start the season, you may have to end up keeping an extra undrafted free agent guy, right? One of the things that Chargers fans may remember is back in 2019 when the Chargers had Roderick Teamer. And Roderick Teamer was one of the undrafted free agents who made the team because a screw bent backwards in Derwin James's foot, and he was suddenly out for 2 to 3 months with a fracture. And so, undrafted free agents can make the team simply by proving themselves in training camp and just being the extra body that's needed there. So I don't think there's one that stands out to me in terms of like, that guy's got the juice. I know a lot of people have like Gerard Clark on Twitter. I haven't gone like fully into watching him, but he's got a lot of pass rushing juice too. So maybe he ends up kind of sliding in there depending on how the team wants to replace Braden Fajoko and like some of these other things, just if they need another body in the defensive line room. But for me, I'm immediately looking at corner for the undrafted free agents in terms of their way to make this roster because of the uncertainty around J.C. Jackson. But I just think that's how it should be too, in terms of how Brandon Staley utilizes his DBs and corners as well. I think that's something that's also important to point out. We kind of talked about Quentin Johnston already, but like Athir asks, will Quentin Johnston start over Palmer? I believe he should, but give me some of your thoughts. Quentin Johnston, like, I don't know if it's a who will start over who situation, right? Quentin Johnston is your wide receiver 3, right? If you're doing on the depth chart right now, he's your 3, Palmer's your 4, and then Davis and Guyton are your 5 and 6 in any order. But like right now, I would say that Quentin Johnston's clearly going to get those reps on the slot and the outside over Palmer. The way that Joe Lombardi used to do it is that you had Keenan and Mike as your wide receiver 1 and 2, and then projecting into last season the way that it was supposed to be prior to Guyton getting hurt and then Carter needing to take more of a role was that, you would have Palmer as your wide receiver 3, Guyton as your wide receiver 4, and they would rotate in based on what they were doing. DeAndre Carter specifically, only a special teamer really to start the year until, of course, Keenan Allen got hurt in the Raiders game, and then eventually some weeks DeAndre Carter was unfortunately wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2. So yeah, for me, I think you look at that and overall, I think you just see that Quentin Johnston to me should start, over Josh Palmer. They've obviously invested first round capital into it. And I think he ultimately will. The Chargers would not have made this decision with Kellen Moore's offense by putting Quentin Johnston to be wide receiver 4 or 5 to start the year. Obviously, he's going to be pretty heavily involved, but because of Keenan Allen's flexibility in the slot, because of Johnson's flexibility in the slot, like, I don't think that they have an exact way that they're going to like do this yet. That's as ironclad as like the old Lombardi like approach used to be to the wide receiver room. Hollywood at D Ramos Jr. 76. What was the best draft pick and who was your favorite draft pick? You know what? We've talked so much about the Chargers wide receiver, Chargers draft picks. I'll talk a little bit about the rest of the league. I'll limit this to the first round, although like, you could go round by round and like find who some of the other guys were. Of course, I think like when I look at the first round and stuff like that, to me, my favorite draft pick was Jalen Carter. I think Jalen Carter was like an awesome draft pick, and the fact the Eagles got him at 9 was impressive. Everything the Steelers did in the draft was awesome. The fact that they got Darnell Washington, to fall all the way that he did. I know the medicals thing, and that has teams worried, but like, man, you look at the value the Steelers got, taking a bet on Corey Trice as well. I thought that was pretty awesome. And I'll say the Colts had a good draft too. I know this wasn't like exactly the question in terms of like who had the best drafts, but the Colts were pretty solid too, man. I mean, getting Anthony Richardson and being able to kind of build out that offense the way that they did through the draft, I thought was pretty like sneaky good. But yeah, I think you could go a couple ways with it, but you know, to me, the best like value that was probably gotten in the draft, if you had to like limit it to like one selection, yeah, I mean, you probably go to the Eagles with Jalen Carter and Nolan Smith. That to me was probably like kind of the best draft in terms of the first round. Alex Kaiser asks, thoughts on Derius Davis as a wide receiver? I know he'll be a great kick returner, punt returner, but will he play a similar role to DeAndre Carter? I will say that I hope he doesn't play a similar role to DeAndre Carter, and here's what I mean by that. No one should play a similar role to DeAndre Carter last year because unfortunately DeAndre Carter was put into the position where he had to effectively be this team's wide receiver 1 or 2 depending on the week based on the fact that everyone got hurt, right? And so yes, I do think you want Derius Davis taking snaps, and I'm sure Kellen Moore will find ways to use him throughout the offense, but for me, like the way that I want to play Derius Davis is let him get comfortable as a kick returner, punt returner in the league first. That's the first priority. And then, you know, you can extend the offensive responsibilities if you want to. But, like, I'm not giving him that DeAndre Carter role, like, yet and putting that on his plate from the jump just because I think you want that time for him, especially as a rookie compared to Carter, who's like a 5 or 6 year NFL veteran at this point. So, for me, like, I hope the Chargers aren't injured to the point where Derius Davis has to play that much of an offensive role because otherwise we have other problems. And then B, I want him to have that time to develop on Ryan Ficken's special teams first before we like go full into we're just giving him like all of the offensive responsibility. I'll end it up with this question from Jared Wright, who asks, who is one player that you're really sad that they missed out on? I don't know if there's a player that I'm like super sad they missed out on in particular. When I think about this draft, I more think about it through positions. So the fact that they doubled up on wide receiver and took a quarterback and dug in, right? Like it prevented you from getting running back, addressing that in a significant way. It prevented you from drafting a tight end. It prevented you from cornerback or safety. Now, I do believe from a cornerback and safety standpoint, they probably will address that through free agency, right? They're probably going to look at John Johnson, who we know that they've had connections to in free agency. I wouldn't be surprised if they circle back to Bryce Callahan. And then with running back, not taking a body is interesting. And I've had this take brewing for a while, but watching Brett Coleman's Chargers breakdown, man, and I know some people are probably getting ready to click off the video, I wouldn't be stunned if they signed Ezekiel Elliott to a minimum deal. Just because of what he can do in pass protection in this Kellen Moore scheme, and the fact that they don't really have like a running back 2 or running back 3 that really contributes in that meaningful of a way right now, I kind of wouldn't be stunned if the Chargers pulled the trigger on it, especially after this draft where the Chargers didn't really pick up a significant running back body. Obviously, they have Dotson and Tyler Hoosman, in their undrafted free agent class. But for me, that was one that stuck out to me. And I think you look at tight end, and there's a lot of bodies around the league, like Cam Brate, who's still a free agent, and guys that they can find who can be, good enough blockers in this scheme. But of course, I do think eventually the floodgates will open on these free agent signings. And I just saw that the Bills signed Latavius Murray while I was recording this. So of course, the post-draft signings have kind of already started. But that'll do it for me on this episode of Bolt Breakdowns. Hope that you guys enjoyed this one. Hope I got to some of your best draft questions. Let me know what you thought of the Chargers draft in the comments down below. I'll put up a comment and you can tell me what the Chargers draft grade was in your opinion, because that's what I want to hear. So see you guys next time on Bolt Breakdowns. Keep an eye out for Steven and Tyler's video tomorrow, talking about the draft on the Chargers YouTube channel. Still crazy to say that sentence. But yeah, hope draft process was awesome. Thank you guys.